Good day, everybody. Randy Franklin Smith here. And today we're talking about how important it is to get early warning when stuff like ransomware gets loose, or really any kind of advanced persistent threat APT type attack. If we don't capture the sound of the attack prior to the impact actually being made, whether that's a double extortion attempt or standard encrypted, ransomware play, then it's obviously too late in the attack life cycle. So we're going to talk today about how we can really stack our defenses up to find out about this before they get to that point. And we're going to use MITRE ATT&CK in order to accomplish that. We're going to zero in on what I'm referring to as the intermediate tactics in the typical sequence of MITRE ATT&CK tactics that the bad guys use. And I want to thank LogRhythm for making today's real training for free possible. And I also want to introduce Michael McGinnis. Michael is from LogRhythm, and he's going to be showing you some pretty cool technology they have called MistNet and how it fits into the type of detection that we're talking about today. So Michael, thanks a lot to you and the rest of the folks at LogRhythm.
Thank you, Randy. We're really looking forward to this. It's going to be a great conversation.
So first of all, I just want to discuss the overall typical progression of ransomware attacks through the lens of MITRE ATT&CK. And then we're going to zero in on the intermediate tactics that provide us enough time to disrupt the attack, to respond, but also make enough noise that we can hope to detect it. And we'll talk about, for each one of these tactics, some of the typical techniques used to accomplish the tactic, and then the type of noise that those techniques make or don't make, and where can we record that noise? Basically, what logs can we use to to detect that? So let's go. All right. So I don't have the MITRE ATT&CK numbers on these tactics, but what we're looking at is kind of a rolled up view of the usual sequence of events in an attack. And we're looking at, first of all, over here on the left in gray, we're looking at what I would call or preliminary tactics. In fact, they are part of what MITRE calls pre-attack, and that's reconnaissance, resource development. I just recently did a webinar on resource development. One of the key things is, the standing up of command and control servers and the setup of domains and domain fronting and all the other resources that bad guys need to set up prior to launching an attack on you. Then, things really get going inside your network with initial access. And that's that first time that someone clicks a link or opens up a document and allows a macro to run. Bam, that's initial access. They are now, running some initial code on one of your endpoints in your network. Now, fast forward, and with typical ransomware attacks, they have to exfiltrate the data. They can't threaten to release and leak that data unless they've exfiltrated it. And of course, they encrypt your systems so that now we have a double extortion attack. And that's the typical type of attack nowadays, not just encryption, but hey, we've also exfiltrated this data. Here's some examples of the data that we've got, and we're going to post all of this online if you don't pay. So what happens in between that initial access and then the actual, what MITRE attack calls impact. Well, you've got all these intermediate tactics, and that's where I believe we have the best chance for detection. Now, as you know, I say best chance because there are even things that you can do back here in resource development. If you're monitoring domain name registration, you can potentially catch phishing attacks before they even get going. And I'm not saying that there's nothing that you should do about initial access. I'm just saying for today, we're going to zero in on all of the parts of MITRE that commonly have to happen between initial access and the actual impact. Because a lot of these just, you cannot accomplish a number of these tactics without making some noise. So if we're listening to it, we've got a chance. All right, so we've already talked about the preliminary stuff. Let's zero in on those intermediate tactics. And what we're talking about is execution, persistence, maybe privilege escalation, maybe they do some amount of defense evasion. They probably implement some techniques of credential access. They absolutely have to do discovery if they are going to exfiltrate data. If they're just encrypting your systems, then that becomes an availability thing. They don't necessarily need to be very discriminative about what they encrypt, especially if they encrypt, system level files. Lateral movement is almost always something that the bad guys have to do because they typically gain initial access to one little endpoint out there on your network, and there's no way we can bring a company to its knees to where it actually has to shut down unless we can take over, at least one critical system, and that usually includes a multiplicity of systems. So lateral movement, we have to get from one system to another. If we're going to exfiltrate data, we have to collect it first, and then throughout this whole process, we, the bad guy, need access. We have to communicate. We need command and control. Now, all of these, like I said, create some amount of noise if we're listening to it. So let's drill down into the first one, and that's execution. So some of the most popular techniques that fall under execution would be a command shell or scripting interpreter. So in the Windows world, which is what we're talking about primarily here, that would be running stuff in cmd.exe. That would be running PowerShell or a VB, a Windows scripting host, Python. All of that would fall there under 1059. Bad guys also achieve execution, that is the ability to run their malicious code and utilities, and basically to run ransomware itself. They might do that by running scheduled tasks, or they just, especially at the beginning, rely on the user to execute it. And that, if we're talking about a specific EXE, or not specific, if we're just talking about a classic executable, that's where that's the technique we'd fall under there. They also sometimes use system services and or a combination of shared modules, that is, in Windows speak, a DLL, for being able to get their arbitrary code up into the system and execute it. Now, most of these techniques have sub-techniques, and it gets very specific, and there's always new ones being added. But this is a great opportunity for us to be listening to what's happening on our systems. Now, we are talking about a lot of data and a lot of different systems, but just think, if we are watching the processes being executed, so that's security log of NID 4688. If we are watching scheduled task events from the Windows security log, and if we're watching changes to services, so new services being created, services being started and stopped, there's events for all of that, then we are capturing a good bit of we're capturing a good bit of the sound that is unavoidably generated when attackers use these techniques. If we want more detailed information, Sysmon helps, especially in this particular tactic with regard to providing the hashes of EXEs and DLLs being loaded. Because as most of you are aware, the name of a file does not necessarily give us assurance that a known set of instructions being run are actually run. Just because you see notepad.exe executing, we don't truly know that if that's notepad or not unless we get the hash of the file. Now, that's opening up a whole lot more work because Windows gets patched all the time, and so there's not just one hash for a known good program like Notepad. Every time it gets updated, of course, there's going to be another hash. So if we're going to be tracking the hashes of executables and DLLs being loaded on our endpoints, then we're going to need a robust way to build a dynamic whitelist of at least, whether we know for sure that it's legitimate or not, it's important to know if we've seen it before or not. And then we can at least zero in on the new code, the new versions of EXEs and DLLs that we're seeing for the first time on our network. That's a key opportunity to zero in on EXE-based, PE-based ransomware. But the bad guys love to use PowerShell. There's entire hacking tools and red team tools built out of PowerShell, like PowerShell Empire. So that's the bad news. The good news is PowerShell has a lot of detailed logging if we've turned it on all of these thousands of endpoints that many of us have to deal with, and if we're collecting those events and monitoring it. And if you look back through my library, I've done quite a few webinars on PowerShell audit logs. So the information is there. The sound is there. You can't escape it. If you're a bad guy and you use PowerShell, you're going to make some noise. But is that noise being recorded, and is anybody listening to it? Couple important points here. If we're going to be tracking the execution of EXEs and also the use of cmd.exe, it's very important that we also capture the command line parameters, because just saying that cmd.exe executed or seeing that PowerShell executed only tells you what I just stated. It doesn't tell us what command was run. It doesn't tell us what PowerShell script was executed. Same with Python. We would only see that, oh, python.exe or whatever your Python interpreter's exe name is, that ran. If we want to know what was the name of the script or the command shoved in via, you can even potentially shove in an entire script just through the command line parameters if it's short enough, then we have to also be logging the command line itself. And that is an option in group policy that you've got to turn on if you want to see that in the security log on event ID 4688. Beyond that, where else would there be some noise with execution? Well, file system activity could potentially be useful, although again, we're talking about even more data. But let's just say we can know whenever a file is renamed to being EXE or DLL, or a file is created with that extension. That would be extremely useful. And of course, there's other extensions, right? PS1 for PowerShell and so on. So we need to know our scripting extensions. Also, file integrity monitoring has a play here, has an opportunity to capture the noise made by some techniques associated with execution, because sometimes what the bad guys do is replace a known good exe with a corrupted version. Now, corrupted in terms, not in terms of it's going to fail to execute, but corrupted in terms of, perhaps a better word would be tampered. The bad guys have added additional bad guy code that gets executed maybe in a separate thread when this normal, typically legit exe or DLL is loaded up and executed. But file integrity monitoring has the potential to catch that. So that's just execution. But we can count on a ransomware attack using execution. Michael, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on this, but there's no way you can get from initial access all the way to impact it with ransomware if you haven't achieved execution in the victim's environment.
That's a 100% accurate statement. And it's funny you bring up things, before I even saw the slide, when you brought up things such as file integrity monitoring, process monitoring, those types of things. I mean, if you work in a financial, space, and you see multiple instances, in my experience, one outbreak was a corrupted version of calc.exe. And,
there you go.
Okay, well, without file integrity monitoring, that was, it was an accountant that had clicked an email, when we did the remediation and did the root cause analysis, there was at one point 18 instances of calc.exe running, and they were taking up, I want to say it was over 60% of the memory, but nothing caught it because there was no file integrity monitoring. And it's tough to do and at the same time, it's also tough to do file integrity monitoring on workstations. It can be a lot of noise just even in a SIEM environment. So 100% agree with you on everything you've stated here.
All right, so let's move beyond execution. Let's talk about persistence. Now, in MITRE attack, there's two types of persistence. There's gaining persistent access, that is through maybe a backdoor account. So we want to make sure that we can still log on to the system even if the legitimate user account whose password we've guessed gets reset. So that would be access persistence. That's not what we're talking about today. We're talking about the other type of persistence, which is that our malicious code remains active and executing, even if the user logs off, the system reboots, or things like that. So the bad guys have come up with practically a million different ways. I'm, speaking hyperbolically, but we're talking about a lot of different ways to achieve persistence. There's just, Linux and Windows especially are just riddled with places where you can tweak a little setting, add a registry value, and suddenly an arbitrary command or an exe is going to get loaded on some type of predictable frequency would be the best term, best way to put it. So, some of the classic ways, is just put something in your logon script or in your boot process. But same way with, as we mentioned with calc. Now, calc doesn't get run on a predictable basis, but lots of other EXEs in Windows do. So we might also, again, get into tampering with the contents of an EXE just because we know this EXE gets run frequently. So we add a couple extra entry points and spin up another thread where we have our bad guy code running. They've also found these obscure ways to schedule, to add a scheduled task that is executed whenever an event matching certain criteria is logged to a specific log in Windows. This is through WMI. And so, all right, well, we know that every time the system boots up, we're going to get some system startup events. Well, all we have to do is add a scheduled task triggered by that event, and if the system is rebooted, we know that we'll get restarted as well. And there's lots of other ways. Simply, setting up a scheduled task as well. So some of these are very obvious. Others, and I think we did a webinar in the past year or two on just trying to identify all the different places in the registry where persistence can be gained. And that's something you could find in the webinar library. But the bottom line is, you can't get this persistence without making a modification somewhere to the system. It's a matter from the defender side of identifying every single one of those places and listening for changes to them. So that requires file integrity monitoring. From the security log, it requires that we're doing file system access auditing on important files like autoexec.bat and similar logon script files in the sysvol share of domain controllers. Of course, absolutely registry access, because that's where, in terms of sheer number of different ways you can get persistence, you have the lion's share. Monitoring scheduled tasks, even looking at environment variables. So this requires a lot of setup, but it's one of the, I think, most effective ways of catching bad guys early in the process is if we identify every single possible way that you can gain persistence, and then we audit changes to all of those registry settings and files, and we get really good at identifying what's normal for our environment, then we've got a highly elevated chance of catching this, and it's going to be early detection, because one of the first things that a bad guy does with every single endpoint that they get that initial access and execution to is then ensure persistence. Privilege escalation. So that's like getting admin, basically. Now, when you drill down into privilege escalation in MITRE-ATT&CK, it largely overlaps. The techniques comprising it largely overlap with execution and persistence. So we've covered most of that. There are two key areas that are more unique to privilege escalation, and that's access token manipulation and just your standard privilege escalation attacks through a buffer overflow or something else. These, though, are difficult to describe in terms of the sound that they make, and that's probably just a wordy way of saying that we don't know what to listen for usually for these attacks, especially zero-day attacks under 1548, because we don't even know they exist yet. Now, access token manipulation, we may be able to detect past the hash attacks because of some techniques that folks have come up with there by preloading our system with fake tokens and known password hashes, so that we basically were lacing our system with tracers or red herrings that we can pick up if the bad guy stumbles across them and inadvertently uses them. But in terms of a systemic way of detecting privilege escalation, you've covered most of it if you're already listening for execution and persistence, and I don't see great opportunities for the areas that are more specific to privilege escalation. Now, your more sophisticated attackers are aware that you are trying to detect them, and so they try to evade your defensive techniques. Now, again, we've got a number of overlapping tactics that we've already covered. We also have some tactics under defensive evasion which are very silent. And for instance, that would be obfuscation, which includes encoding files. Now you could say, well, you can search for encoded data, but there's so many legitimate uses of encoded data that now it gets down to context and, you know, how realistic is it that you can say, okay, this is an unusual place to see encoded data. I'm not saying it's not possible, but I think it would be fairly case by case, and it's not something that's going to have a long shelf life, in my opinion. Masquerading, if you drill down into what 1086 technique is at MITRE attack, again, it doesn't make a lot of noise. It's important to know that bad guys do it, but I don't see a lot of opportunities to detect it. Same with things that bad guys do to evade sandbox detection. So just one quick example so you know what I'm talking about there. There are technologies, you know, that every file that comes in through either a web download or an email attachment are quote unquote detonated in a sandbox. They're opened up with their host application in a sandbox, and then the sandbox technology observes what it does and looks for any strange behavior on its part or strange system activity. So the bad guys try to evade that by just saying, all right, when we wake up, first of all, we're not going to do anything for 10 minutes. Second of all, we're going to see, are we running on a VM? And if we are, then we're not going to do anything. Things like that. Again, those things don't make a lot of noise. A file that doesn't do anything for 10 minutes, a malicious file that doesn't do anything for 10 minutes looks like a good file. There are, though, some tactics under defense evasion that are fairly unique to it and might make some sound that we could detect. For sure, domain policy modification is one of those. So the bad guys sometimes will actually go into Active Directory once they've gained that level of authority and make changes to domain level password and lockout policies and audit policies to either shut down monitoring or shut down other defensive controls that you've set up. So the obvious question is, are we monitoring changes to our domain policy? Those domain policies should be pretty static, and that should therefore be something very loud that we can pick up on, or I should say very clear, a very clear signal that we could pick up on if we're listening. The bad guys also will try to hide artifacts. So artifacts may be, you know, the ransomware program and other files associated with it. And so that may be as simple as setting the hidden bit on the file system, or it may be more sophisticated as in storing it in an alternative file stream on some other existing normal innocuous file. So in that case, you know, there's ways to look for that. Look for files that have been set to hidden. Of course, we have to get used to what's normal in our environment as far as hidden files, but alternate file streams, looking for the creation of alternate file streams on files where we wouldn't expect to see that. Alternate file streams is fairly unusual, is a fairly unusual file system feature. And so it's reasonable to think that we could monitor by scanning. This would require scanning files, enumerating all of the alternative file streams, and then analyzing it and bubbling up the ones that don't look normal for our environment, because invariably there's going to be legitimate uses of these.
Hey, Randy.
Go ahead, Michael. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, I just wanted to jump in real quick. because this is defensive evasion. This is one of those areas that I've talked to a lot of customers, been in a lot of environments. This is actually a very, very critical area, and I'm very happy you brought this up. To do with defensive evasion, a lot of organizations, with their security platforms out there, will either, obviously use a signature-based, scan of your environment, of your endpoints and everything. And a lot of push has obviously been recently to, machine learning and UEBA functionality. One thing I always like to point out to everybody, while those are excellent tools and leverage them to the fullest extent, if they're done correctly, they are very helpful. One problem that I have seen is that either A, people see and they assume an anomaly is a risk, or is, they say, hey, this is out of the norm. Okay, well, this is risky behavior or whatnot. And they go full board and to an investigation, and it turns out, okay, well, in this case, this is not a big deal. Well, they accept that risk. Well, here's the thing. When you accept that risk, you essentially are saying, okay, that one instance is okay for the organization. When you do that slow and low behavior that's out there, and that's what these adversaries are really counting on you to do. When you find that stuff, is to say, oh, okay, this is actually not that big of a deal, accept the risk. And that way, on those scans in the future, any behavior that gets executed out of it, it's very, very difficult to not only detect it because you've, quote unquote, accepted the risk in the machine learning models, as well as you are accepting, hey, if this gets published, okay, well, it's considered, it's part of this. This is fine. And then you're onto your next tactic, which is, I know what you're going to be saying next, but I just want to make sure everybody's aware that, this is a very, very serious part here. And this is the most important tactic, because when you get to this point, you are really on defense and you need to be prepared to go on offense. So,
yeah. All right. Thanks. Well said. So at the end of the day, this is a matter of monitoring for the bad guys trying to change, weaken, or shut down your defenses. It may even be things as simple as disabling the firewall, turning off auditing, or in the case of indicator removal, then clearing audit logs. So there's events for all of that. In the security log, you have policy changes on domain controllers. If you want to monitor, if you want to catch bad guys changing group policy objects, which there's actually examples of that, look back through my library. I've done webinars every few years on how to audit changes to group policy objects and organizational units. And need we mention registry changes again? But also part of defense evasion can be file system permission changes. And shutting down services, especially security products, or shutting down the Windows firewall, or turning off key policies on Windows firewall. All of the stuff is in the native Windows security log. But beyond that, scanning for hidden objects, whether that's hidden in the file system, hidden in alternative files, streams, or all of the other ways that bad guys have come up with. Let's talk about credential access. This is another one that's not very noisy in direct terms. So, the fact that we are using some credentials, a password that we have guessed, or a hash that we have stolen, that doesn't make a lot of sound. That pretty much blends in with other authentication activity, unless we're doing a lot of correlation to tease out unusual instances. Now, the good news is credential access does employ a lot of the other tactics that we've already talked about, and so it may be detected if you're monitoring for execution. For instance, you can't do credential access without execution. But our best chance for detecting specific credential access, in my opinion, is more a matter of watching the subsequent use of stolen credentials. And so that may be unusual combination of the to and from device, or location combinations. Why is this account, which is an employee in the U.S. division of the company, why is this account suddenly showing up over here in APAC? And there's of course situations where that would happen, but there's also plenty of accounts that never access anything outside their division. That's just one example that comes to mind. Also, logon session types. So why are we seeing an account that's been created for database services, like an account called SQL Server, why are we seeing that log on with an interactive logon session type? These are definitely scenarios that have occurred in attacks, and if you were watching for them, you would get some indication that credentials are being used in an unusual way, and quite possibly in a malicious way. So where's the source of data for this? Where's this sound recorded? That would be in your logon and authentication events of any type of system. If we're talking about Active Directory, obviously that's going to be the logon, logoff, and the account logon category of categories in the Windows security log. Now, that being said, I'm kind of getting into lateral movement also. So I think if we're trying to detect the use of these tactics, I think there's a lot of overlap between credential access and lateral movement. And in general, if you're doing what I'm going to recommend coming up on lateral movement, I think you're going to catch a lot of the credential access techniques as well. So stay tuned. First, though, I want to talk about discovery. That's tactic 7. This is another one that's pretty quiet at the system level. In Windows, there's just not a lot of events or audit telemetry that's going to tell you someone is looking around the system. That being said, it is worth checking out event ID 4798 and 4799, because those do tell you when local accounts and local account or local group membership is being enumerated. So those are definitely useful, but they're only going to catch that little corner use case, edge case of discovery. There's so many types of discovery that has to happen. Discovery maybe we're looking for, well, what are the other systems on the network? What are the other user accounts in the domain? How many domains are there in this environment? Or where is the confidential data that we want to exfiltrate? All of that comes under discovery. And like I said, it doesn't make a lot of recognizable or unique noise at the system level. At the network level, it can potentially be more noisy, because oftentimes the bad guy will have compromised just some, the first endpoint or the endpoint of the first employee that they were able to dupe with a phishing attempt. And so a lot of times they don't have much determinism over the endpoint that they're using to discover other assets on your network. And so for that reason, they're the queries that they run may jump out at you as being unusual for the type of endpoint. So if it's the endpoint of a call center employer or cubicle, and it's suddenly going out there and enumerating domain trust relationships and doing large-scale scans of IP address ranges, that you can see how that becomes noisier at the network level. So that means then, are you watching that kind of activity on the network? Can you identify network scanning? Especially on file system stores, can you identify content scanning? So on an event-by-event basis, discovery is not going to look different than a user just going to a folder, listing its contents, opening up a file, and reading it. But if you look at the overall pattern and volume of events, then you may be able to tease out and say, wow, a typical user is not going to be able to look at this many files within this amount of time. This looks like it could be discovery, but as you'll see, it could also be collection of data as well. But that's okay. When we see an unusual number of files being read by an end user, probably at a rate greater than what they would normally be able to, then whether it happens to be discovery or collection for staging purposes of later exfiltration, we're winning. Now, this is where we get to one of my favorite. I think that this tactic has maybe the best potential for us to detect ransomware attacks early in the game, or at least a good bit of time prior to impact. And that's, first of all, because almost any attack is going to require some lateral movement. It does require a significant amount of data analysis, because what makes lateral movement different than normal network activity? Well, again, on an event-by-event basis, it doesn't look unusual. It's just, okay, this endpoint connected to this other server endpoint on the network. But if we're looking at the history of all the object concerned, so by objects or entities, that's a better term. What are the entities here that we should be considering with lateral movement? Number one, user accounts. Number two, endpoints. So that's workstations and servers. And then number three, processes, or I should say not processes, programs. So here's just a few examples. In our environment, we've made a commitment to using SAWs, SAW, Secure Administrative Workstation. So it's a workstation dedicated to only admins logging on to perform privileged actions. And along with that, then we say we don't log on to non-SAW systems with a privileged account. Yet we're watching our authentication and logon events, and we see a privileged account and a non-privileged account having logged on in the recent past, or just recently, to a given endpoint. We shouldn't see that combination on any endpoint. Privileged accounts should only be logging on to SAWs, and non-privileged accounts should never be logging on to SAWs, and vice versa with non-privileged systems. But you see, it requires a lot of data, it requires correlation, and it requires you to have information about the systems on your network, classification of systems and user accounts. And that may be possible from data in Active Directory. You may be able to infer it from IP addresses or naming conventions. I also love this one. Two endpoints communicating with each other for the first time. So This could be a client and a server. So we've never seen this client reach out to this particular server before. Or how about these two servers communicating with each other? Or even crazier, these two clients communicating with each other. Maybe any two clients communicating with each other. Now, one of the important things with all of these is that we're only going to be able to make these reliable detections if we are able to limit our analysis of entities that have history. So in all cases, we only want to know about new combinations between a set of entities who all have some history. What am I getting at here? Well, when a new laptop that's just been stood up comes up, there's going to be all kinds of systems that it communicates with for the first time, and those are false positives. When a new employee is hired, everything they do is new to begin with. So we, a new workstation, a new endpoint popping up, that may be interesting of itself, but it doesn't indicate lateral movement. Lateral movement is recognizable potentially when we investigate new combinations between old entities. So this is a workstation that's been around for a while. It's developed a usage pattern. This is a user account that's been around for a while. It has a usage pattern as far as what programs it runs and which systems it connects to. It just ran this new file with this new hash. That is interesting, but it's a new file, so there's going to be lots of other examples of that. Where's the source of information for this? It's right there. It's in the security log, in your logon and authentication events, and in your process tracking events. But like I said, it requires a baseline, and it requires correlation of data, and it requires contextual awareness of your environment. What class are these endpoints? What class are these users? But this is an absolutely fantastic way to leverage the fact that bad guys can't do lateral movement without making some noise.
Hey, Randy, one thing on that, sorry, sorry to make you go back. Just want to follow up everything you said, spot on, 100% agree with. Just want to add one little bit of advice for the audience out there, is especially when it comes to your assets, is to early and accurately and consistently update a list of what your critical assets are, what they're for, what they do. Because no matter what, was discovered in your environment, whether it's a domain controller, a print server, or just, some Raspberry Pi that you're doing as a project, you need to know what is in your environment, because you need to be able to have those, if somebody's accessing a new domain controller and you don't have that as a critical asset, you want to make sure that you laser focus in on those types of assets to make sure that they are having the proper monitoring, and that you actually have visibility into those devices. So just one little tidbit.
Thanks. Well, moving on to collection. Again, this is fairly quiet unless you can zero in on, or not just that you can zero in. This is quiet unless the amount of data that's being collected stands out, or the location that they choose for staging the data jumps out at you, or if the archiving activity is notable. Let's say they use some freeware version of 7-zip or some other zip file instead of what comes with Windows out of the box for some reason. And you're monitoring process tracking, and you see that. Oh, now you have zeroed in on the fact that they're doing collection. And you are very close to impact at this point, because they're collecting this data. It's going to be exfiltrated, and the next step is impact. But hey, we're still pre-impact, so it's worth watching for this. I just think that this is probably not going to be the most successful and the biggest bang for the buck area to be watching. Number one, it's late stage. Number two, it doesn't make a lot of recognizable sound. Some things that you could do, though, is let's say you have, here's something you could do to leverage a file classification technology. So you have a file classification product running that scans your network to identify different types of data, and then it classifies them. Well, why not look for new stores of classified data, whether it's PII or whatever, and you may potentially stumble across some place where bad guys are staging their information prior to exfiltration. Other things that the bad guys may do during this phase is capture, whether that's capturing audio or camera or keystrokes. But those are very specific things that you would be trying to audit for there, and it's probably only something that an EDR solution is going to pick up for you. Otherwise, the sources of information for this are things that we've already talked about, and that's, you know, your file system activity and your process tracking, aside from if you are doing file content scanning and you identify new locations of classified data. Here is another big bang for the buck, and that is command and control. This is a constant tactic that the bad guys have to employ during nearly all attacks from the beginning all the way to the end, and that is you know, communicating with the embedded malware on your network and giving it more instructions, analyzing the information and the responses to commands that it comes back with. So to do that, they have to get out of your network and onto the internet. So we want to analyze two things here. Outbound communications, that's outbound traffic, but also I want to encourage you to be aware of analyzing web activity from endpoints, because the bad guys, you know, it's the constant arms race. So the bad guys are realizing you're paying attention to the protocols and the outbound network connections they're using. So could they blend in with your normal, you know, users and what they do out on the web, just browsing the web, going to social networking sites? So the bad guys are actually leveraging social networking sites and forums and places where you know, Twitter, to post command and control data going in both directions, or using them as dead drops. So simply doing protocol analysis of outbound connections, you know, would miss that. That being said, though, the vast majority, as far as we know, still happens through you know, a typical outbound connection to a, you know, a direct connection, or through a proxy to a command and control server. How can we recognize that data as being different? The bad guys are using protocols that look normal. They're using, you know, HTTPS a lot. They're using DNS and things like that. So one thing we could look at is Cadence. Is an endpoint checking in on a regular, predictable basis? Now, of course, bad guys can be aware of that, and some of your more sophisticated attackers specifically vary with random offsets and other things to eliminate any kind of recognizable cadence. And you know, for instance, Cobalt Strike and Beacon have those capabilities. But we've got to watch for all of this. What about unusual endpoints reaching out to the internet? That could mean that the bad guys oftentimes don't have great amount of control, especially at the beginning, about which endpoints that they use. So they may take over some server that normally shouldn't be communicating with the internet at all. Look at your north-south data volume proportion. Sometimes that can be a dead giveaway. Normally, normally HTTP traffic of typical web browsing is going to be mostly data coming down, not data going up. A reversal of that could either mean you're using some cloud application and that's legitimate, or it could mean that data is being exfiltrated. The bottom line is there's a lot that attackers have to accomplish between initial access and impact. So understanding the techniques and identifying those techniques most likely for your environment and that have the best chance of detection is where we need to spend our resources. We need to identify sources of information, that's mostly logs, where the sound of intermediate tactics can be recorded. Then we've got to be collecting those logs, and we've got to be listening to those logs and then stop the attack. So we've got something great planned for you from LogRhythm. Mike is going to show you how MISNet fits into all of this. Michael, I'm going to make you the presenter and take it away. After that, folks, I'll entertain the questions that have come in so far. And please keep all the questions coming in, whether it's for me or for Michael.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Randy. So, hey guys, I just wanted to talk to you real quick, obviously, about some of the newer things out there. This is great content, especially very passionate about the MITRE attack framework, obviously. I do want to kind of walk you through just essentially what we are doing here at LogRhythm with aligning with the, of course, the MITRE attack framework, with ransomware, and generally all the tactics as well, obviously techniques, but mainly the tactics that we are identifying within your environment. So what I'm showing here, this is actually, your traditional SIEM. This is our LogRhythm SIEM. And you can see in here, I have an alert in here for, okay, look, there's a ransomware behavior. This is how you're traditionally going to be doing it now with your legacy SIEMs. Typically it's detected in this instance. I believe this one's off of it's off of threat feeds based off of behavior. So about almost a year ago, LogRhythm made their first acquisition, and we're beyond excited for it because this is a revolutionary new solution. It's the MISNet NDR. And the reason why it's so revolutionary is basically how early now you're able to detect things in your environment before even your traditional SIEMs would maybe detect an alarm or, create an alarm, or even your other solutions in your environment would alert you to, hey, this behavior has occurred, or hey, there's a ransomware outbreak and it's almost too late. So I want to just show real quick the interface here. As you can see, if I zoom in here, you'll notice we got a little pulse meter here. It's because this is going to sit at the edge of your environment. So this is going to get you, of course, that east-west traffic, for insider behavior, but also combining that with the ability to do north-south behavior. So we're actually looking at a full fidelity view of your environment. And occasionally you'll see this ball here, probably won't do it, of course, now in this demo, but that'll go into an attack indicator. And as those attack indicators build and build and build, we'll actually using fog computing, we're actually able to create incidents. And these incidents are actually what you're going to want to laser focus on in your environment. Now, the real power behind with MISNet, though, especially related to ransomware, is just how easy it is now to detect it in those early stages of compromise, like we were talking about earlier, with the execution. So looking here, you can see a lot of variables in the, there's some incidents going on in here, but I can actually now pivot. The way MISNet is designed it's designed specifically around the MITRE attack framework. So I could take something like, I could just simply go in here and do a search. And you'll notice off the bat, we got all our techniques, all of our tactics that are constantly updated from MITRE themselves. And I could just scroll over and you can see how, there's some red here. That means that those tactics have been found in your environment. I could go even as far as going and say, hey, I'm looking for specific software. These are all the different in the wild breaches, causes, root causes after analysis that we have discovered, and this is constantly updated. So I could go in here and take something like Robinhood, get a little description if I hover over it. This was the one that was used against Baltimore City. So I could go ahead and turn that on, close this out, and I can actually now see in here what tactics they used. Okay, well, seeing the green, that's good, that's good. But then I see over here a couple green, but then I do see 47 instances where that software in the MITRE attack framework, this tactic matches. So I can simply just click on it. And now I can see all the instances of where this issue is occurring. So these are all matching that same signature, that tactic. I could even couple it over and I could say, all right, well, so this is all those instances. I got, over 10 pages of it, probably, thousands of entries of it. I can even just simply click on the I want to see specifically the encryption events. Now I can see, all right, here's those encryption events. Now I could go in here and I could say, hey, I want to see, some details on it. I could even bring up the information, get more of the event details. And I can get all this contextual information. We're pulling all this information specifically from MITRE. Let's say I want to take it a step further and I can just say, all right, go down here. I could say, all this metadata, and I could go ahead and I could just create a case out of it. All right. So I create the case that quickly. Load up here. And this will automatically build out all those different packet files, all those logs that we have capturing early from your environment. And we're actually able to create this case for you. First thing we're going to do is we're going to explain, okay, here's what we discovered. Okay, here's all the logs that we did that we're able to collect down here. This is the timeline of it. Let's say that this was this is farther along in the attack sequence. Let's say that there was multiple. You can think of this as a network DVR so that you can actually replay the packets in your environment. And more importantly, though, is this recommendations. We're actually able to say, all right, this host is showing this. You may want to look for other hosts infected. We'll automatically do that. But let's say I want to take action in here. Well, I could go ahead and I could run a response. I could start blocking things at the firewall immediately. I could any of these playbooks that I want to have it run, I can have those run automatically for me, or I can do it manually, and I can trigger these off after I've done my investigation. But the real beauty behind all of this is that this is all out-of-the-box behavior. So there's you don't have to modify your data. You don't need to do any special, you don't have to modify, like, hey, we need your packet or your data to look like this or that. This is pure packet data. And it's just beautiful because you can actually just pivot and implement MITRE from day one. All those tactics, all those techniques, they're right there. So, Randy, that's all I've got for a demo. I wanted to keep it short and sweet because I wanted to have plenty of time for Q&A. So,
all right, sure. We got some questions for you, and folks, please keep them coming. So, Orda asks, is this part of the regular LogRhythm package?
So this is, we just acquired it. So this is our NDR platform. This is not part of, this integrates with our LogRhythm SIEM solution. It is separate. It could run with or without LogRhythm itself. So it's a completely independent product.
Okay. Powell asks, how do automated reconnaissance tool sets like Bloodhound get mapped into MITRE for identification? Okay, now I was thinking that was a question for you, but that may be more, that's more of a MITRE question, and I'd have to think about that some. Let's go to Chris Peters. Chris says, let's say that you're able to detect a ransomware attack in progress using some of these techniques. What sort of countermeasures should you apply? Time obviously being of the essence.
Absolutely. Actually, I brought on here one of my colleagues. I brought a couple of people on here. Hey, Rich, I don't know. Do you want to kind of jump in here? This is might be a good time for me to introduce Rich to to the conversation.
Yeah, sure. Good afternoon, everyone. So if I understood the question correctly, it was around countermeasures once you've uncovered, these types of tactics taking place. And I guess really the best overarching answer is you would need to adopt a defensive strategy quickly to essentially stop the attack, stop the attempt. Now, environmental aspects are going to really determine how you go about doing that. Is it going to be isolation? In other words, are there, an individual or a series of systems that have been potentially compromised? You would take those and isolate those from any environment. You can apply tactics or procedures to your gateways, right, to ensure that communication, outbound communication, is no longer taking place. Right, there's a variety of different defensive strategies that you're going to have to adapt to in order to really fully thwart one of these types of attacks. Because as both Randy and Michael have alluded to, right, there's a lot of different tactics that are taking place or could potentially take place here. So the tactics that have been applied are really going to drive the defensive strategies that you adopt.
Yeah, Stephen has a related question. He says, I see very good detection capabilities here, but what about the R to remediate the issues? So I know you have capabilities to, for instance, SOAR capabilities, right? To be able to say, okay, when we see this, bam, isolate the user, quarantine the system. What are other things that, other integrations you have, or other things that you see in playbooks for that kind of thing?
Well, and I think you really called it out, Randy, right? Isolate the user, isolate the machine, add any criteria that you might need to a firewall to thwart that either that inbound or outbound communication, right? And you have to do that quickly because, once they're in and they've found an avenue, that can spread or move quickly throughout the environment.
And IOCs of, indicators of compromise, related file hashes and things like that, being able to put a policy out there that says, okay, have we seen this file anywhere else, so that we can identify not just, blocking the known compromised, but, have they spread through lateral movement, and clamping down on that as well.
Well, and it's also about minimizing, and maybe minimizing isn't the right word. It's also about segmenting your attack surface, right? Zero trust comes to mind, right? If you can implement zero trust, that makes it much easier to segment any environment and also gain visibility into activity across boundaries within zero trust. So that's important as well.
So Ryan has quite a foundational question to cover all of the required logs and monitoring. How much strain on servers and end user devices in terms of computing performance does this create? How much logs need to be collected on endpoints? Is it 10 gig a day, 100 megabytes or what? So I want to take a couple of those, Ryan. Turning on auditing and turning on logging, sysmon, stuff like that on your endpoints nowadays does not create a load that you're going to notice unless you do something insane like turning on auditing of the Windows file system of every read access on every file on the system. But that, it's a very extreme example where you almost have to go through extra effort to create an impact from the auditing. So as far as the source systems where you're collecting, where you're generating this audit data, it's just not an issue with today's systems. Now, getting all of that data aggregated to one place, is, that's probably the first reason that LogRhythm came into existence, right? And other products like yours.
Yeah, that's a different challenge, Randy. As you said, enabling those features on an endpoint really aren't impactful. What does become impactful is pulling all that data back to one single point of repository, and then what comes into play there is any compliance drivers that you might be beholden to. How long are you required to hold that data now that you've gathered it?
Yeah, and so I don't know. Do you guys have any rules of thumb of for a mature environment that's getting most of the logs that they should be, what to expect in terms of data per endpoint? I definitely have never been able to come up with a rule of thumb like that. I wish I could, because I know it would be useful to people.
Yeah, we do have estimations, and our estimations are just a culmination of years of experience, and those estimations align with different product types: firewalls, proxies, servers, workstations, domain controllers, etc. That helps us understand how much data could potentially be generated. And then when it comes to guidance after you've consumed that data, there's really two types of data once it's been consumed. There's hot data, and then there's warm or cold data. It would be my my ask to keep as little hot data online as you possibly can, because anything that's cold can be compressed down and takes up much less space. So if you can get away with 60, 90 days of hot online, then anything beyond that can be pushed out to archive, and that can save a considerable amount of space.
Dominic has a question. I think it relates to the UI, and that is of LogRhythm. Is that a thick client? Is it browser-based or both?
It is. Well, so it is a browser-based. Yes, there is a thick client if you are on premise, but primarily, yes, it is just a web interface that you would interact with on a day-to-day basis.
All right, and what is the architecture, by the way? Did you get into that of MistNet, and what kind of on-prem footprint does it have? And that comes from Susan.
What's good, Rich? Hey, you want to get in the architecture of this, because I'm about to sneeze really.
Yeah, certainly.
Allergies are killing me all of a sudden.
So MistNet specifically is a SaaS model. There are sensors that will be deployed into your environment, and that can be, on an as-needed basis, depending on the amount of data or areas that you're wanting to gain visibility into. And those sensors will communicate information back up to, the master implementation of MistNet itself. Now, what's nice about MistNet's architecture is it's not an all or nothing approach, meaning, once we've gathered information from a particular sensor, we don't have to pass that information to other sensors in order to do any type of correlation or machine learning. We'll pass what we need to across the wire, and what we need to is just represented via metadata. So we're passing much smaller amounts of information around in order to do any type of analysis on information. What's nice about that is, when you start to think about all the cloud-first technologies and digital transformation that's occurring in the world, right? Organizations are now concerned with costs, right? How much is it going to cost me to move information from one cloud provider to another? Whether that be through, infiltration or exfiltration pricing. So we're able to help any organization by minimizing those costs as you look across different domains and locations of your infrastructure. It's a very distributed model.
Gotcha.
And I know that was high level, but without an image to talk through, that's probably the best I can do.
Okay. And Jonathan would like to know, do you have integrations is there an integration story for MISNet with EDR solutions?
As a matter of fact, there is. It's either just been released or is about to be released. The next version of MISNet takes, some of the premier players when you think about the EDR space and integrates those tightly into MISNet. So, we can now take control using those EDR technologies like a CrowdStrike, for example. So there's very, very tight integration there.
All right, awesome. Let's see here. I think we've gotten just about everybody's question answered. We really appreciate everybody spending time with us today, and that's some awesome technology that you guys have got there with MISNet. It's a nice complement to LogRhythm technology as well. Thanks a lot for showing it to us today, Michael.
Oh, no, it was my pleasure. And thank you so much for having us. Really do appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Where should people go if they would like to get more information or engage with you?
So if you go to LogRhythm.com, obviously that's the #1 source. You can reach out to us there. You can find me on LinkedIn. It's Michael P. McGinnis on LinkedIn directly. And then I believe that, that's also our Twitter handle. So you can get us pretty much on any social or through the web. We're more than happy to have an extended conversation about any of this.
All right. Look, folks, thanks a lot for spending time with us today. And we, as always, hope it was useful. And we'll be in touch again soon. Bye-bye for now.